Welcome to the Affiliated Monitors Expert Podcast, hosted by Tom Fox on the Compliance Podcast Network. Today we cross-post a recent webinar hosted by Affiliated Monitors entitled Crisis Compliance in the Federal Marketplace. It was moderated by Rod Grandin and included panelists Eric Feldman, Dismas Lakaria, and Thomas Topolinski. They looked at maintaining effective ethics and compliance oversight controls and culture in the midst of coronavirus and the attendant economic dislocation. It's a fascinating exploration. I know you will enjoy it. Thanks for listening. The Affiliated Monitors Expert Podcast Series is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Today I'm joined by Vin DeCiani from Affiliated Monitors, and we're going to take a look at some of the factors that influence the ethical culture of a company. Vin, first of all, thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Good morning, Tom. Nice to be here.
Vin, there are multiple levels, there are multiple cultures, there are multiple groups, there are multiple stakeholders in every company. But I was wondering if you might start with what you see as the importance of the role of senior leadership as it flows down through an organization to influence the ethical culture of a company.
Sure. So obviously ethical, leadership plays many critical roles in establishing and trying to either improve or create an ethical culture. And sometimes that starts at the policy level, right? Establishing policies, core values, mission statements, that sort of are intended to drive business. So that, obviously at the policy level, senior leadership is going to be doing that. But there's so much beyond that. As we talk to, employees in companies who are looking up at, the senior leadership, they do recognize that, the leadership of the organization really does set the tone. How they act, how they behave internally within the organization or externally to third parties or to the public generally. The messaging that they send down. People are watching that kind of behavior. And it does say, so much about a company. So we talk about, policy setting, but I think that the behaviors and the commitment of senior leadership to the mission and the core values are equally important to those core values, the words themselves. Some of the other things that we see in terms of senior leadership, how do they treat their staff? Are people treated fairly, or are there sort of delineations of, favorites and not favorites? Those kinds of things they say a lot to people. Is there an inner circle and then there's everybody else? That creates a culture that is not necessarily inclusive and not bringing out the best in people. That's a senior leadership issue. We talk all the time about the alignment between incentives and performance as a metric, right, of ethical culture. And that's going to be driven by senior leadership. If senior leadership is only sort of driven by bottom line, the dollars, then that's going to be an important factor in, how people behave and what they see as important. Again, from both perspectives, the leadership and then everybody that's under that leadership, and we've talked about this before, there's got to be a connection in terms of communications. We've worked with too many companies where it's very pushed down communications from the senior leaders, and it's good messaging. It's like, do the right thing, always, be mindful of the customer and those kinds of things, but it's words. And so that's one thing. But the second thing is, are the senior leaders in the organization listening to their people? Are they giving their people the opportunity to be heard as to whether or not they're getting those messages, whether or not they're living those kinds of values? So communication and establishing good communication lines with line staff and with management, also very important. We talk a lot about, in terms of senior leadership, visibility. So many companies that we go to and we do our assessment work, the senior leaders do not get out into the field. And so sometimes they'll go to a geographic location and only meet with, the senior managers. And they have no visibility with the staff other than they were there. And they don't take the time, and it could be a short period of time. They never take the time to actually go sit with people or have an all-hands meeting or just reach out to a few people, have a cup of coffee with them, see how they're doing. Those kinds of, behaviors, I think, are very important, in terms of some of the factors, Tom, that drive, ethical behavior from the top.
Vin, many of my listeners know that I also have a podcast on leadership called 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. And what intrigued me about your remarks were many of them are some of the very basic techniques that I talk about on that podcast, really individual leadership techniques. And what has really intrigued me here is you're talking about these same techniques, but as not as an individual personal leadership, but as a way to influence positively the ethical culture of a company. And let me just point to the last two examples I wrote down. Are the senior leaders visible? Do they get out and let people see and talk to them? And perhaps the most important leadership skill I'm aware of, listening. And you're actually tying those to an ethical culture.
Well, yeah, I am. And the reason why I am, is talking to employees in companies, all industries, because we do, work in all industries, and in all sort of walks of life. And the things that we talk about is, oftentimes, senior leadership came and they sat down with us and they made us feel like we belong to the company and we're not just, worker bees. They made us understand where the company's going, what the mission and vision of the company is, and how it applies to them in the field. They got an understanding of the importance of ethical culture. And maybe it's not in the words of the leader, but it's in the behavior of the leader, that it is important to be inclusive and that they are valued. So, Tom, I think it goes hand in hand with, you might be giving a business message, but it also ties, very much to the ethical culture and the commitment of senior leadership to drive behavior.
So let me flip the question just a little bit, Vin, and ask you, in your experience, have you seen ethical cultures that have been challenged and, I guess more importantly, they responded to that challenge in an appropriate and positive way, in your opinion?
Yeah. So, sometimes we get involved in matters as an independent monitor or then proactively, right? And, to do that, you really need to get a lot of input throughout the organization. And so we have worked with companies where the senior leaders talking to us in these one-on-one interviews, these in-depth interviews, are giving us a picture of what they think is the image of them in the eyes of staff, but also what they believe are sort of the policies and procedures that they have tried to impress upon people. Very good example is this, the idea of an open door policy, right? So I've talked to senior leaders who say, "Oh, I've got an open door policy. Come in and speak to me about anything. I'm always here. I want to, be welcoming and, address people's concerns or answer their questions." That's at the senior leadership level. And then as you start to talk to people within the organization, the picture that they present is something 180 degrees opposite, where they're terrified to go talk to that leader because they have heard of situations where there's been some form in a variety of ways of retaliation because they went to speak with them. I've seen a situation where, in one instance, the leader would almost create a mechanism for him remembering somebody that brought something up that was inappropriate, or went against what he was looking for them to do. That creates this really sour, right, type of culture. And I think the companies that are concerned about it, and I know we're going to talk about the CEO role in a minute, but they're very attuned to what that kind of relationship looks like and how to improve it. And sometimes it means, that the senior leader may have to be removed or moved to a different position because they're not impacting in the right way staff, and how the cultural behavior of the staff is in action, right? It's a sensitivity that some companies, they don't have an awareness of what's going on out in the field, and they perhaps should be a little bit, a bit more attuned to that.
So, Vin, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I've been visiting with Vin DiCiani, and we've been talking about some of the factors that influence the ethical culture of a company. Vin, thanks so much for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
As always, Tom, thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode in my 5-part exploration of ethical culture with Vin DiCiani and Eric Feldman from Affiliated Monitors, who is the sponsor of this series. I hope you'll join us again for our next episode. This special 5-part series on ethical culture is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.